I was researching Ottoman era slavery of Europeans. Grok told me, Grok, Grok told me that the Crimean slave trade and the Barbary slave trade combined enslaved between 6 to 9 million mostly white women for 4 centuries. Doesn't this contradict the leftist paradigm that white people were never enslaved or oppressed? American slavery gets brought up endless times by leftists, yet they never talk about the enslavement of millions of Europeans by the colonial Islamic Ottoman Empire out of sheer ignorance. Why isn't this talked about in academia? I think it deserves more attention. Okay. I'm not sure if the leftists say that the white people were never enslaved. I personally am not aware of that. Maybe I've missed something, maybe I've not, I don't know. But the Crimean slave trade and the Barbary slave trade are a real thing. I'm not sure how many people, how many women were enslaved, but this happened in two phases. And before the Crimean slave trade and the Barbary slave trade, you had the trans-African, what the African slave trade. The Arabs would procure, let's say, labor from Africa. Okay. And millions of Africans were enslaved as a consequence. And millions of Indians were enslaved, by the way. By the way. Now, when it comes to the Crimean slave trade and the Barbary slave trade, there is one factor in common between these two. One factor in common. What is that common factor between these two? It is the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So the Crimean slave trade centers around the Black Sea. Let's take a look at the map. We're talking about the Black Sea region, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, etc. The Black Sea is south of Ukraine, as I'm sure we know by now. This is the Black Sea. And the Crimean slave trade centers around the Black Sea. It centered around the Black Sea. Okay. So what was the deal? You had Italians and Genoese slave traders who were slaving out of a place called Theodosia. It's now called Feodosia. It was earlier called Theodosia, and even before that, it was called Kaffa. So this was the center of the slave trade, the Crimean slave trade. And this peninsula is the Crimean Peninsula, right? Sevastopol, Simferopol, etc. This is Crimea. So out of Kaffa, which is now called Feodosia, you had the slave trade that operated from there. And it was Italian and Genoese merchants. Where is Genoa? Where is Genoa? Genoa is here. Genoese merchants, they were doing the slave trade. Where have we gone? From the Black Sea region. And they were enslaving Europeans and selling them to the Ottomans. So essentially, it's sometime in the 15th century, late 15th century, that the Ottoman Empire conquered the Crimean region, the Black Sea region. Okay. And you had something called the Crimean Khanate. You had Khans of Crimea. They were distant offshoots of the erstwhile Mongol Empire. The Mongols had occupied Russia for a couple of centuries. And then they left behind Khanates, and there was a Crimean Khanate, which was an Islamic governance system, an Islamic kingdom, you could say. And the Crimean Khanate was conquered by the Ottoman Empire around the late 15th century. So the Crimean Khanate was allowed to continue by the Ottomans as a vassal state. And it became a major supplier of slaves to the Ottoman Empire. Okay. And by the 16th century, 17th century, the Crimean Khanate would, send raids into all the way to Poland, all the way to Lithuania. They would send raids into Russia, into where is Hungary? Where is Hungary? Have we lost Hungary? Here is Hungary. Hungary, the Balkans, the Baltic region, all over the place. So the Crimean Khanate was very powerful. It was a very powerful vassal of the Ottoman Empire, and they would twice a year, roughly, launch slaving raids all across the region, all the way into Russia, all the way into Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, the Balkan region, all the way. And they would export these slaves, mainly women, also children, mainly women, to the Ottoman Empire. Okay. And then obviously, like every empire, every state, you have a decline. So the Russian Empire starts becoming powerful in the 17th, 18th centuries. Okay, and then there is a Russo-Turkish war uh, sometime in the 18th century, and the Russians win the war against the Turks, against the Ottoman Empire. And the Russians, what do? They annex Crimea. Crimea was annexed by the Russians, and that brought an end to the Crimean slave trade. And that was the end of that barbaric era where the Crimean Khanate would take millions of European women as slaves and sell them to the Ottomans. So that's the Crimean slave trade. Now let's talk about the Barbary slave trade. That's slave trade operating in the Mediterranean region. The Barbary coast was the North African coast. You know, the coast of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, essentially. That was the Barbary coast. And you had slave trading pirates, essentially, okay, who would operate from North Africa. North Africa was Islamic, it was Muslim, and they would operate out of this region, and they would launch raids on Europe, and they would procure slaves, okay, and they would sell it to the Ottoman Empire. So where would they launch these raids? They would launch raids, raids, slave capturing raids on Spain, on Italy. Obviously, that makes sense. On France also. France also makes sense. But also eventually, they started making raids all the way to Britain, to Ireland, and even Iceland. And they would capture mainly women, and they would bring them back to places like, let's say, Tripoli, Algiers, through Tunis. These were all slave markets. And from there, the goods were transported to the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, and other places. Right? So, so the Barbary slave trade, you could say its roots were in the Roman period, but it became a big deal in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Okay, I think the 17th century was the peak of the Barbary slave trade, and eventually the European powers became navally dominant. Powers like Spain, powers like Portugal, powers like England, etc. And because of that, the Barbary slave trade eventually wound down. And once the French conquered Algeria in the first half of the 19th century, that was the end of the Barbary slave trade. So you had millions of Europeans, mainly women, who were enslaved. What was the number? I'm not sure about the number. I'm sure you can ask AI, or you can look it up what the numbers are. But millions of Europeans were enslaved and sold to the Ottomans. The Ottomans also had very large numbers of African origin slaves. So what happened to the African origin slaves? If you had millions of European slaves who were sold to the Ottomans, and you also had millions of African slaves who were sold to the Ottomans. So clearly, if they are selling European female slaves to the Ottomans, the Turks, will obviously procreate with them and further whiten their population, their offspring, right? They wanted to become a white population. And that's how they would do it, by either abducting millions of Greek women and having children with them, or by purchasing slaves from the Barbary pirates and having children with them. So that's how the Turks went from being a Central Asian race to being a European race. Now, what about the millions of African slaves they'd taken? You see, most of these African slaves were males. And what they would do to the male African slaves is they would castrate them. That's what they did. So the African slaves were used as slave labor. And that was it. None of their genetic traces survive. The most horrible way of exploiting human beings. That's what the Ottomans did. And that's the story of the slave trade. The Ottomans, what a brutal, barbaric empire it was. The Ottoman Empire.